Hey guys, so today we're going to look at reducing inflation and the term deflation as well. Okay, so first of all, one of the things that's really important to note is that inflation tends to occur around the time of economic upturn. So we see high levels of inflation at the minute because we're currently in an economic upturn. Of course, we know that the ECB, being part of the European Union, means that we cannot have inflation levels above 2%. And we've spoke before about government policy, that they often use fiscal policy to make sure that inflation is kept in check below that 2%. So we're going to have a look today at how to reduce inflation, how the government do so. So, how do you reduce inflation? Well, the best way to reduce inflation is to take money out of the economy. And when you take money out of the economy, you reduce demand. So, how do you do that? The government can't physically just pick money up and take it out of the economy. Instead, they have to look at trying to implement certain policies that would mean that people pay more money or save more money. But the whole aim is to reduce demand. So I want you to think back now to demand that we did in fifth year, at the very beginning of fifth year. And one of the things we said that changes demand or can increase or decrease demand is price. So we know that if you increase the price of something, it reduces demand, and if you decrease the price, it increases demand. So how can the government work at that then if they don't actually control the price? Because the government don't. It's companies and firms that produce the goods and services that control the price. Well, they can control it, or they can have an influence on it in two ways. Everything we know that every good and service in Ireland has to contain VAT. So that's one way in which the government can take money out of the economy. What they can do is they can increase VAT. So particularly with the tourist tax, we saw that when the VAT increased from 9% to 13.5%, we then saw the prices increasing of goods or of services. So in particular, we saw restaurant services, the prices increasing. And then this leads to a decrease in demand. So again, reducing demand, taking money out of the economy. The second way is if you increase PAYE. This then leads to a decrease in the person's net income. So while it doesn't affect their overall gross income, their take-home pay, their net income, that will decrease, which then leads to a decrease in demand. The final way is that they can introduce a savings scheme. So we talked about this when we looked at interest rates and money and banking. That one way to take money out of an economy is to make it really, really worthwhile for them to save. And by doing that, you can increase the interest rate, which we know that we don't have any control over because the ECB controls our interest rate. So instead, the government decided to introduce what was called the SSIA scheme. So SSIA, we've talked about this before, it's a Special Savings Initiative account. And that was that you would get 25% back on your investment. So for example, if you saved €4, you got €1. So these three are definitely the best way that the government can try and influence inflation, aim to reduce it. The other things that they can do is they can reduce government spending. So for example, on things like social welfare payments. You could also reduce public sector wages. So we know that in order to reduce that bill, they may have to offer retirement packages or early retirement packages to older staff. So when we're talking about public sector staff, we're thinking about teachers, doctors, nurses, Gardaí, so army people, so on. Just so that you won't reduce the workforce, the public sector workforce in size, or you may decide that that's what you need to do, but you can actually take on new recruits, new graduates, and put them on lower contracts, so lower paid contracts. Finally, we have things like national wage agreements, so minimum wage, and we could reduce the minimum wage. And then last but not least, we have increased competition. So we know that if there's more competition in the market, then firms will compete with one another to drive the price down. We've talked about this before, so I'm just going to briefly recap on it again. It was one of the most poorly answered short questions in the mocks, so please take note here. So when we talk about the ECB and monetary policy, Remember, monetary policy is any action by a central bank that controls the interest rates, the money supply, and also the availability of credit. They're the three elements that you needed to answer that short question. So let's look at how the ECB then uses monetary policy to influence inflation. So first of all, looking at interest rates, we know that if the ECB increase interest rates, it'll discourage borrowing and encourage savings. This will lead to a fall in demand, which will lead to a fall in the price of goods and services in the economy. From money supply, we know that if they reduce, so money supply grows faster than real output, then demand for goods and services will exceed supply, and what we have then is demand pull inflation. So often what the ECB will do if they want to reduce inflation in the EU 27 countries is that they will then just take money out of circulation. So they may buy up foreign reserves of euro currency. Finally, the availability of credit. So we know that if credit is more readily available, then this will lead to an increase in spending, which will lead to inflation. Credit is more available or more readily available during an economic upturn. During an economic recession or downturn or recession, we'll see the availability of credit dry up. Banks are a little bit nervous about loaning out or giving loans because maybe during a recession or during economic downturn, they see that people are really struggling to repay loans that they have. So they may not be as readily available to give credit. So that's something when we see when during an economic upturn or during, let's say, for example, the Celtic Tiger, there was a lot of credit available, and then because of that, people could buy high value goods, which then led to inflation. So just on a final quick note there, deflation is just negative inflation. Prices are going down rather than up. And deflation, we don't really talk about an awful lot in economics because we tend to focus on inflation and how inflation can be reduced as such as opposed to talk about deflation. If it does happen, it can be caused by oversupply relative to demand. So for example, more hotel rooms than there are people to stay in them, more houses than there are to people to buy them, a sudden drop in demand or investment or government spending, or all three. So we would have seen that during the recession, we would have seen a certain level of deflation because there was a drop in demand, there was a drop of people investing. So for example, buying houses or investing in shares, and then government spending dropped as well because we were in a budget deficit. And finally, persistent unfavourable balance of payments. So we know that an unfavourable balance of payments will be where the value of imports is higher than the value of exports. And that would cause deflation because what you would have is more money leaving the country on imports than coming in on exports. So what happens when we have deflation? Well, we see an increase in the purchasing power of money. Employers use this to justify wage cuts, and the government uses it to justify cuts in social welfare. The government can save money on capital projects, increase national competitiveness, so provided that Irish prices fall by more than competing countries' prices do. So when our prices fall as a result of deflation, it makes us more competitive, particularly abroad, and that's why we would have seen over the last couple of years a huge increase in exports. And finally, a fall in investment. So business people may postpone investment due to an expected fall in demand. Company profits will be eroded. So what you would have seen at the very beginning of the recession, if we even talk about people who were thinking about buying houses, some people who had the money to buy houses at the very beginning of the recession actually waited maybe 6 months to a year because they knew that the demand had fallen for houses and they expected prices to fall further.